Today is May 16th, 2013. My name is Suzanne Conversano. I am interviewing Phoebe Norton. This is the second interview in a series of the History of Mental Health Services in Boulder County for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program. I am interviewing Phoebe Norton. Phoebe Norton worked for the Mental Health Center of Boulder County from 1966 to 2009. She was the executive director for the Mental Health Center from 1982 to 2002. When Phoebe retired, she continued her work as a volunteer with mental health services. Welcome, Phoebe, and thank you for assisting us with this project. Can you tell us where you were born?
I was born in Marion, Ohio.
Marion, Ohio. And what year was that?
1938.
1938. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Marion, Ohio.
What was that like? What kind of lifestyle did you have?
Well, yeah, it's an industrial town. It used to be a railroad town when I was growing up, and they made heavy equipment, and so there were sort of the workers, and then the managers, and my family was kind of in between because my father was a junior high school principal. My mother was a volunteer with all kinds of things, and we had a large family, and so and we were kind of in between too. Also the neighborhoods, we were just on the edge of the poor neighborhood, but not quite in the wealthy neighborhoods. And I grew up kind of keenly noticing the injustices between sort of the haves and the have-nots, and the dividing lines, and it didn't affect me too much because I got to, I had a rich childhood and I was provided with a lot of good things, but it did affect me some, and it affected what I saw all around me, and I just keenly felt the injustice, and befriended the kids from a different junior high school that was on the wrong side of the tracks, and was friends of theirs for quite a long time. We did a lot of fun things together, square dancing and farm pokes, and I don't know. It was great. We had a great time. So I had a good childhood. I worked also at the Y. As what we called a gray Y counselor. And I knew from an early age that I wanted to be a social worker. So that was about the closest you could come in Marion, Ohio. So I worked with kids from the poorer schools for after-school recreation programs. And that was very instructive, and I had good supervision. It was really good. And I worked in, fresh air camps in the summertime.
Mm-hmm. So was that, what about that, was it the injustice that motivated you to want to be a social worker, or was there something else?
Well, it was partly that, partly probably my own family dynamics. I grew up with an older sister who had schizophrenia from the age of 13, really. And so I know what the treatment was like then, and what the stigma was like, and how that affected our family. And so I watched all that in my own family. I didn't know that I wanted to be a psychiatric social worker, but it's not a surprise that I ended up in the psychiatric field.
Where were you in the line of children?
I was fifth out of six.
Fifth out of six.
And my sister was 12 years older than I. But she was kind of a favorite sibling. She was in, when she went to college, off to college, and then librarian school. Yes, she did amazingly well. She was very bright, but had a hard time using it. But she did amazingly well considering the amount of illness that she had. But she would come home on vacations, and I got along with her really well, probably better than anybody else. And she would take me on early morning hikes, and she would bring me books, and often plaid flannel shirts were very popular at the time. And she would, I don't know where she found the money to buy me a shirt, but she did, and I always treasured that. And I treasured we'd get up before anybody, before dawn, and go out and look at the birds and the trees and the flowers and whatever, and it was just very special.
It says, where did you go to school? So mostly, once you graduated from high school, then what did you do?
Well, I went through the public schools in Marion, Ohio. I'm a big proponent of public schools. I think they're very important because, and I noticed then, you mix with everybody, especially in the high school. There was one high school for our whole town of 40,000 people. And it's really your last opportunity in some ways to mix with everybody on that, where you're so integrated into classes and everything. And I really valued that. And so then I went off to College of Worcester in Ohio, which is a small liberal arts school that's sponsored by the Presbyterian Church. So my family were Presbyterians.
What was your major in school?
Sociology.
Sociology.
And then I went, in my junior year of college, I went to the American University of Beirut and the Beirut College for Women. And I spent the year there. So I wanted to see things from a different culture. I didn't want to go to Europe. I wanted something very different. To see how the United States looked through other people's eyes. Boy, did I get a lot.
What did you learn? What were some of the things
Oh
you
my
learned?
goodness, yeah, that would be a whole different subject.
No, your top 3 things you learned with that, like, and how whatever you learned there that really influenced your life after that.
I think, I went with the idea that I was learning from people, and I did a study of was an American Aid project. And I because we had independent study from the College of Worcester, and I still needed to do that while I was there. And so I did a study of something called the Casmina Project. And it was where we had gone in as the big brother to try to, put a water well in a community development center and so forth in this little village. And I did a lot of research in the archives, both at our embassy in Beirut and also with the Lebanese ministry. And they were very kind to me. They finally got a person to take me out to this project, and I spent a day there with an interpreter because I could only speak some Arabic, speaking with the people in that village. And what I learned was, it was a basic principle that you learn in any kind of group psychology or sociology class, that you have to really start where people are and then build with them. And we'd kind of come in, top down. And so what was left was that this little community center that they had was sort of a little broken down. It was being used as a chicken coop. And the water well was still there, but still the women were walking, for a half mile or a mile to get jugs of water from the spring, the traditional spring where they'd always gone with the big jugs on their head. And that was such a, and so I always, that's one of, probably Dr. Warner talked about that as well. He shared that value of mine, that you really need to have a shared vision with people and to get everybody involved and included right from the ground up as opposed to top down. So that's the way that we tried to manage, and he was a great partner in that respect, along with a whole lot of other people in the community.
Right.
Then I spent the summer in Marseille and worked with Algerian refugees and got a different view, of course, of the United States. But I have a lot of empathy because I had a lot of Palestinian friends that had been displaced twice. And of course I have a lot of empathy with the Israelis too, but I can see both sides. But the other thing I came out with is that it's very difficult to go into somebody else's country and be a social worker. They need their own social workers. And if we want to put money into their countries, we should be helping them build their own professionals. And in fact, I met a person on a ship coming back who couldn't get a job in Iraq. He was going back to Iraq. He was had an engineering degree from the United States, but he was having a hard time getting a job because the engineering jobs were being taken by the British at that point in Iraq. And while I was in Lebanon, the British got kicked out of Iraq. It was a very interesting event. So that's a whole different thing.
But a lot, you really immersed yourself in lots of different experiences that sounds like it helped you form your philosophy when you ended up being the executive director. It really served you.
Yes.
Having those perspectives.
Yes.
Yeah. So you went to, after you graduated from college, then what did you do then?
Well, I worked summers through college, and one of the places I worked, and partly during the school year too, was at Apple Creek State Hospital, which was an old-time state hospital for the service area of Cleveland, Ohio. There was Cleveland State Hospital too, but Apple Creek was just outside Cleveland, between Cleveland and Worcester, where I went to college. And so I worked as an attendant, and I was, because I was temporary, I was a rover, so I saw all the wards, and which was very interesting, of course, from intake onto the back wards. And I used to be one attendant on a ward with maybe 80 people on the 3 to 11 shift. And one of my jobs was to go down to give a count, phone in a count at the change of shift of how many people were there. Wow. And I would walk down between these rows of beds, and I would get 79, then I would get 81, then I'd get 78. Finally, I went to the elderly attendant who was on the next ward, just a hall down. I said, I don't know what to do. It's my first night on this ward. I can't get an accurate count. She said, oh, honey, don't worry about it. She said, I'll even bed with somebody else, somebody in the bathroom. You're not going to get an accurate count. Do it 3 times, take an average, and send it in. Oh, wow. But that's how it was. I mean, it was very, in some senses, impersonal care. And if you were an attendant with 80 people on the ward, you had to find out what the power structure was in that ward and make friends with those people so that you had some chance of not having chaos, And part of my job was swabbing floors and cleaning up dishes and all that kind of stuff. But, and you wanted people to help you too, so you wanted to get along with them.
Right. Now, did your sister, did she end up spending time in a hospital?
Oh, yes.
Was it that hospital or other hospitals?
There was, she was in a private hospital, and she was in a public hospital, I think, in Hawaii later. But I had a number of experiences when I was an attendant in that hospital. That was just one of them. And it's kind of a funny story, but it shows the lack of care, I think. Right. And one of the other things I had to do once on a back ward, I had horrible experiences. It was horrible. It really, for the staff, it was degrading for the staff and the people that lived there. It was a dehumanizing experience, in order to keep control. What they did was over-medicate people. So it was it was just when we're beginning with things like Haldol and Stelozine and so forth, some of the new antipsychotic drugs, but they were overused, and people were then, just vacant. And I saw people, and they had mixed people with developmental disabilities on the back wards in with people that had psychiatric illnesses, but average intelligence. But I saw people chained to potty chairs, chained to their beds in order to just be able to control them. And one time I had to take dinner to this one woman who was in seclusion, and there was a little slit in the door that we would put the food through, and I was assigned to take her out so that she could have a break and go to the bathroom. And it was dark in this hole she was in. You went down a step, so it was really was like a hole, even though it was a room, and no light at all. And so that, she was blinded by the light when she came out, but she was grateful for some kind words. And you know, and I remember helping to hold people down. We used electric shock treatment, but not in a healthy way. Always, sometimes it was used as punishment to keep people in control. And it wasn't with all the new, you know, now it's used in a very constructive way to help with people with severe depression where nothing else has worked, and it's very helpful to some people. But at that time, it didn't have all the safeguards around it. It was performed out in the middle of a ward and with people
watching and
held down. Well, people were at the other end of the room, but still, yes, with people watching. And I had to help hold people down for that. And I just can't describe. Now, when people watch, what's the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, they think, oh, you know, or Snake Pit, they think how horrible things were. This was even more horrible. More horrible. And as you can tell, I'm still traumatized by remembering those experiences. So I vowed that if I ever had a chance, that I would want to help get people out of hospitals and into some sort of supported community living, because these were great people. I mean, on the 3 to 11 shift, you have more time to sit with them and talk with them and learn about them. And so there were a lot of wonderful people there, and it was hard to see them being so degraded.
Well, yeah, that was a dark time in our history of treatment.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something about the history of how we've treated mental illness. You know, in the 1700s in the United States, we had more of an agrarian society. Now, Dr. Warner might have mentioned this to you. In a more agrarian, simple society, people are kind of more able to integrate people with mental illness, and they can have jobs to do, and they don't seem so different, and in fact, they're healthier. And so there was home care. Now, some of that wasn't good. They would lock somebody in an attic. You know, you can read stories about that, but still, it wasn't horrible. It wasn't like what I just told you about. And then in the 1750s, we had more urbanization, and it was much harder to integrate people into, to give them a job and be watchful of them like it was on a farm. And so we had asylums. People were kept in basements of county jails, of county hospitals, and jails and almshouses. And when I first went, I mean, this is kind of unbelievable, basements of county hospitals. But you know, on the corner of Iris, just north of Iris, that old stucco building that's there, that's now used by social services, it used to be the county hospital. In fact, when I was first a therapist there, a woman came in and she said, "Oh, this is where I had my first baby." And she was an elderly woman at the time, in this very room that we were sitting in that was then an office. But when I went there in the 60s, you could go down in the basement and see where they had kept the mentally ill people in cells in the basement with slits in the door. Now, they were bars, so at least they had some light. But that happened right here in Boulder County. And it wasn't as long ago as the 1750s, because that building's been completely renovated, and you won't see any sign of those cells anymore. But they were there in the 60s, and it was probably in the early 1900s, I would guess, they were still there in Boulder County. So then we had periods of crusading, you know, periods of Dorothea Dixon and so forth. Dix, is it Dix? Dix, Dorothea Dix. And we got in, here, to the moral treatment of people with mental illness. We had a Horace Mann. We built state hospitals throughout the United States and wanted to return people to individual reason. And then we had mental hygiene reform, and it became the financial responsibility more of the local governments. And we've seen these waves since then, you know, the feds coming in to help and then dumping it, and the state and, you know, not doing so much. We just are in a wave like that, unfortunately. And in the 1900s, we had state care acts, and the financial responsibility was returned to the state, so there was all this crowding that I talked about,
Right,
which was in the 1950s. Yes, that's when I was there. In the 1920s, the asylums were renamed to mental hospitals, and more small institutions were encouraged, like Fort Logan. Fort Logan was a model when it was started, and I'm sure Dottie remembers that, and had more kind of group care with more democratic principles built into the group care. And then in the 1950s, we had the new concept of community mental health. So we began to empty our state hospitals, and we put people back in the communities with good community support. In the 60s and 70s, we had good federal funding of the community mental health centers throughout the nation under Kennedy. And in fact, our mental health center had been, when I first arrived in the 60s, was just a little clinic of 12 people and one psychiatrist. And we treated adults and kids and outpatient, and the inpatients were at Pueblo State Hospital, which was still a big overcrowded institution. And we didn't get to use Fort Logan. I don't know why, but anyway, we sent our people to Pueblo, and once a month people would go down and coordinate about the clients the patients from Boulder County. And the community mental health centers had a really good support at that time, and they had a nice continuum of care. It wasn't complete, but it was what we knew at that time, and the medications were getting much better. And I think that it was a time of a lot of innovation and excitement and growth and real learning about how we could be successful and help people recover and be integrated in the community and have housing and jobs and so forth. And then in the 1975, we started with the community support system movement and had more of a continuum of care. It's because we realized that people couldn't just, if they were severely mentally ill, outpatient service wasn't enough, that they needed social supports and vocational rehabilitation, jobs, housing, etc., housing being key. And then in the 1990s, we've gotten into the recovery movement. But as you know, there's been a move over, the federal funding dried up in the late 70s, early 80s, and the state funding has been drying up. I was interested to see, I mean, there have been a lot of cuts in recent years with the recession, but even before that, and we were having cuts at the mental health center in 2000. You look a little, am I boring you?
No, it's very fascinating. I was wondering if you can talk briefly a little bit about sort of when medications came in, and then was that the reason they actually started to initiate more community mental health centers?
That was part of it. Dr. Warner has a really good hit on this. I mean, part of it was economic, because we had the advent of Social Security and Social Security disability. So you needed the medication, but you also needed a way for a person to live. So people had to have some kind of minimal support in order to be able to have food and clothing and shelter.
So
maybe not food,
so they could get that.
Clothes.
There was government funding to set up that, along with the medications, that made it more possible.
Yes, it was just happened to be at a time when Social Security was maturing. That Roosevelt, of course, started.
So tell me, I'm just going to go back a little bit, but this is good timing, because that's one of the questions I had also, was sort of the history, and you gave a really nice overview of sort of what happened and when and why and what it was like. So then, when you graduated from
University of Chicago.
You went to the University of Chicago
for my MSW.
And so did you specialize in a special part of social work?
I specialized in group work.
Group work, okay.
Because I was interested in systems and societies and social change. I'm very interested in social change, how that happened. And I had studied, when I was in Lebanon, one of my independent studies was on the changing attitudes towards women in the Middle East. And so I studied a lot about social change and continued that as a senior in college. So I was more interested in in group work and how groups work together.
Groups and systems. And systems.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, systems and families as well.
Okay. And then how did you end up, where was your path after that, and how did you end up in Boulder?
At the University of Chicago, I worked mostly in inner city and in what used to be Hull House. It's a famous, what was a settlement house in the early 1900s of people like Jane Addams set up these houses that provided social centers and support for people in the neighborhood. So I was in the last years really of the Hall House because it then got taken over by the University of Illinois Chicago Circle. But we had groups for moms and groups for teens and so forth, and I helped with all those kinds of things. And then after graduating from University of Chicago, I became a school social worker in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. I was following my ex-husband, a mathematician in academia, and so he was in graduate school there, and I worked as a school social worker in Urbana, and realized I needed to know more about psychiatric illnesses in order to be able to work with many of the parents that I worked with.
And then how did you do that? How did you get that?
Well, then we moved to Boulder in 1966. That was in Champaign-Urbana. I was there from 62 to 66. We moved to Boulder, and I decided I would volunteer at the mental health center because I had 2 little babies. And
is that because your husband got work here?
yes.
You moved to the University of Colorado?
Yes.
Okay. That's how you ended up.
And at first I thought, oh my gosh, what a cop-out after being in Chicago and Cleveland, et cetera. But I, of course, soon learned that particularly psychiatric problems are ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And other kinds of problems, for that matter, that
Yeah.
we have our share of in Boulder County. It's not just Boulder, of course, it's all Boulder County. And so I volunteered for a year, and then I was a part-time psychiatric social worker at the mental health center, and got very good training from Rosamond Hathaway, who was the medical director at the time, and Hank Walzer, who was, you remember Hank, who was the director, executive director, a social worker. Wonderful people, both of them. Worked with a nice group of 12 staff in the old county hospital building.
You talked a little bit about this, but who were some of your mentors and role models during your career?
Well, certainly Rosamond Hathaway and Hank Walzer were 2 of the big ones. But also in the community, I really looked up to Ruth Carell and Janet Roberts. Janet was on our board and did some volunteer work with us, and I participated some in the League of Women Voters, and so and being in the mental health center, I was always more neutral about politics, but when I could be involved in the Democratic Party, I was, and so I really admired their work in the community and saw them as role models, both of them, and became friends with both of them.
You already did this piece for me, which was to give me a brief overview of mental health services in America.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions, so we have a good picture of sort of what that was like and sort of the transitions it went through. And when you were working in Boulder, what were the trends? Did Boulder follow the trends, or was Boulder a leader in some of the trends and the changing?
Yeah. Let me talk a little bit more about some another thing that happened.
Okay.
Because I was a school social worker and saw the need for children, even very young children, because I worked with a Head Start program in the summer times, and I worked with the parents of these Head Start kids, and saw the need to really support those children from early on and have them individualized in very large families. And I help the moms make individual stories about each child. And, you know, it was really important work, it seemed to me. And then after I was here for 3 years and got some really good training, we moved to Princeton, and I worked as a, well, I guess first we were, yeah, I might have left this. No, we moved to Ann Arbor, and I worked at Washtenaw County Community Mental Health Center, and they were just emptying their big state hospitals at the time. So I worked in a crisis center, and I also worked in a halfway house, and was helping get people out of the hospital into the community. And what I learned was you need more than just emergency services for these people, and more than just a halfway house. So I learned a lot of things there, and I had some very interesting experiences. Because I was only there for 1 year, the hospital actually hired me, no, it was the Community Mental Health Center, hired me to be placed between the hospital and the mental health center. And they knew since I was only there for 1 year that I might be able to help clean up a mess. So they put me in this halfway house where, well, the 2 halfway houses, one was run by these very kind-hearted people, but very misguided, who believed that you could chase the demons out of these people by, you know, anointing them and helping them go through all kinds of religious exorcisms and so forth. So that was very important to get that exposed to the light of day and get that turned over. So I got to do that. And the second thing was this other hospital, that's other halfway house, which was run by a also very well-meaning guy. But he was a charming guy, and he turned out to be a bit of a sociopath. And what I found out was, because one evening they called me because one of the people that I had formed a relationship with in the house had a gun, and they needed somebody to come and that he trusted and take the gun away from him. So they called me late on a Friday evening.
The person running the program had the gun.
No,
one of
the people living there, one of the patients had the gun. And the person running the house was very worried about this, and very worried the guy was going to shoot him, that the patient was going to shoot him. And so I went over, and I was able to get the gun away from this poor guy. And but what I found out was that he really had a reason to be angry, because he had gotten a job and he was working. It was a very full employment in those days, and a lot of the guys in this house had part-time jobs in the auto plants outside Detroit. And but on Friday evening, when they got paid, the guy that ran these houses would play poker with them and take all their earnings. So this patient had felt like he'd just been fleeced, and so he pulled out his gun. So I got the gun back from him, and we got him in a car and got him taken back to the hospital for a while. But it was just another example, and it was kind of painful because there was a social worker there too. He was a very good guy, but he had sort of looked the other way from this manager, and so I was the one that got to blow the whistle. It was painful because I liked all these people, but it, of course, had to be done. So it was a big learning experience that year in Ann Arbor, and what I learned from that. And I kind of went through this and tried to think, what did I learn from that experience? And the biggest thing I think I learned that year is you have to be very careful when you subcontract for these kinds of services. When you try to, and I get upset when the state, there's not money to be made with this kind of service. So the whole idea of privatizing, you better be very careful with whom you contract and have very close involvement and oversight. Right. And have your workers on site.
So these were private subcontracted places, not state sanctioned. Yeah. All good experiences leading up to your executive director position.
And then the next year we went to we were kind of bouncing around because my husband had postdocs. We went to Princeton, and I worked in Trenton, and with a program for pregnant and parenting teens in inner city Trenton. Now Trenton, that was in 71, and Trenton was just when we were trying to integrate our schools across America, and Trenton was primarily African American and Hispanic, and it was the state capital, so there were state workers that came in during the day, but they went to the suburbs at night, and left these really slum buildings in Trenton. And I visited many of them because I was a home-based worker. And when these kids were bused to the suburbs, these African American and Hispanic kids, and I remember our little project was based at the YWCA in downtown Trenton, and we had a few classrooms there, and then worked out of there. And the principal was African American. I remember she jumped out of her chair. She said, "I have to get out of here. They're, in the suburbs. They're pushing over the buses with the kids on them that are being bused to the suburbs. And my kids are in one." So she just ran, hoping her kids wouldn't have been pushed over. And that around that same week, there started to be riots. And I went to get my car, because I parked a few blocks away near the school administration building. And the man knew that I was driving up to Princeton, that took care of the parking lot. And he said, "Ms. Norton, you going up to Princeton Avenue?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Don't do that." He said, "They're shooting at anything white that comes in sight." So he told me how to go out to the coast. But it was an amazing experience, and part of the thing that was so bad about it was that the state, that you could see the difference. My child was in kindergarten. She went to school in Princeton. She had an African American teacher, so it was integrated, and that was wonderful. But on the other hand, all the kids were white, and they had more books and more audio visuals than they could even cram into the room. Now, when I went into kindergartens and first grade classes in Trenton, where, with the families I was working with, the kids were sharing like one book for 3 rounds of first grade, and they were, torn apart and tattered because they weren't able to afford enough text for every kid. And so the funding for the schools was not primarily state, it was local, but Trenton didn't have any funding source. So then Trenton put in this law that they would have a surtax on people that worked in Trenton to help fund their schools. And the governor said, "Well, that's fine, you can do that, but I'm exempting all state workers." Well, state workers were people that were, you would have had the head tax on. So that continued, and the injustices were just enormous. And of course, I saw it all the time because I was visiting these homes, talking with these families that I cared a lot about, helping the girls get their plans for their babies and their babies taken care of, and continuing their own educations, and the families really wanted to help them. And what I vowed at that point was that if I ever could do it, I would start a more integrated services mental health program for infants at risk. And we did.
Wow. It's nice to have been able to fulfill that goal.
Oh my God. I was so blessed to have been there in the, late 70s, early 80s, when there was a time of innovation. But a lot of this we got from private grants and people that, gave us money and windfalls. And again, I used to say to our staff, be careful what you dream, because we'll probably get it, and if we get enough people involved.
Right. So tell me, maybe do you have some more pieces on the
No,
timeline?
then after that I came back to the mental health center, and I worked as a psychiatric social worker on the outpatient team. And in brief, it was the advent of more cognitive behavioral kinds of therapies, and I worked in a brief treatment program. And also in a day treatment program for people with severe mental illness. And I thought we needed more vocational services, and we all began to work more on that sort of thing. But then I became clinical director and was clinical director for 6 years. That's the position Dottie also had at Adams County
That's how you
Community
knew each
Mental Health
other.
Center. Yeah, that's when we first met, I think. And then became director in 1982.
So tell me, when you first started working at Boulder Mental Health Center, did you, who was the center serving? It was serving the whole community? Was it
serving
only
the whole county.
The whole county?
Yes, and included Broomfield, of course, at the time.
And then, so it served anybody in the county that was seeking mental health services?
Yes, it was a very different picture, and I'm sure it was for Dottie at the time too in Adams County. We saw much more of a mix of the community. So we served people that were indigent and didn't have any means to pay, but we had a sliding fee scale. So we saw quite a few middle income people as well that had some ability to pay on a sliding fee scale. And insurance didn't cover much of anything in mental health in those days, so it wasn't they weren't a big player. And Medicaid wasn't a big player, and Medicare never wasn't then, and it still isn't.
Right. And so there weren't other resources for people who needed the service?
That's right, that had needed a sliding fee scale.
So we at that time, Boulder Mental Health Center was serving people who needed the help on any level and the chronically mentally ill, or we did both?
We don't call them that these days. We talk about persons with severe mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
Just as we would talk about a person with diabetes.
Yeah, thank you for that correction. So that, in numbers wise, what were we doing?
I've been indoctrinated a lot from the consumers that I work with, that I
No, that's
volunteer
really
with in the
good.
National Alliance on Mental Illness.
So were we, how many, do you know, what size of a population were you serving in the community? How many people was that?
I dug out, I don't have too many, but I dug out a couple of old, I think I have one very old one here from 1994, and I can tell you how many people we served then. So we served a total of 5,500 in 1994, and when I left, I think we were serving about, in 2002, we were serving about 12,000, about 8,000. Now I think it's more like 12 or 20,000, I don't know, it's some big number.
And so let's see what the other, so I guess you've talked a little bit about this, but so we'll start with when you were at the Mental Health Center.
Yes.
And we could talk about when you were executive director.
Okay.
And how were you getting the program funded? Where were your funding resources?
Thank God for our county commissioners. Oh my goodness, because we kept getting cut after cut, both from our state general funds. By the time I left, we didn't have any general funds. All of our general funds had been converted to match Medicaid dollars. And so we had Medicaid funds from the state and federal governments, but not general funds. If somebody's not in Medicaid, then you need some general funds to serve those. And the Boulder County Commissioners funded the mental health center generously for that and for a lot of the programs that I'll tell you about that we did jointly with the county that saved a lot of taxpayer dollars.
So really your monies were coming from either Medicaid or from the Boulder County?
Well, let's see, I have a little chart here. So we had federal government monies of Medicare and Medicaid. This was in 2002, the year that I retired from being executive director, of about $7 million. And from the state of Colorado, we had Medicaid funds of about $6.8 million. From Boulder County, we had about $3.4 million. From United Way, local government in United Way, very important, $1 million. Contributions and volunteer services, we have a lot of volunteers, about 200 volunteers, then, including graduate students and MROHP students, who were wonderful. We had about 1.7 million and other sources, small grants and so forth, about 1.7 million. So still mostly from the federal and state government, but the amount that we got, the $3.5 million from Boulder County, made it possible for Boulder County to consider our mental health center to continue to serve people that didn't have Medicaid. And that wasn't true throughout the state. A lot of mental health centers didn't have, and it became increasingly impossible for them to serve people without Medicaid as the 2000s went on and the cuts got deeper.
So what were some of the programs that you were created while you were at the mental health center?
Well, one of the first ones we created was an integrated community infant program, and we did it jointly with the social services, child welfare, and the health department. And then out of that grew also Genesis, which was to help teen parents, and which has been a very successful program. But the community infant program was designed to intervene to help families with infants at risk from the age prenatal up to the age of about 6 months or 1 year. And it was a home-based program. It had a public health nurse and a psychiatric worker who went into the home and helped those parents be as good parents as they possibly could. And if it became very apparent that they couldn't, that wasn't going to work, well, then they got early termination so that the child could be placed before it became too damaging. And so we were able to, we had continually always high success rates of children that reached developmental norms. So it was over 90% of our infants reached developmental norms at the appropriate age and were not victims of abuse or neglect.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, it's so important to begin early, and we also, worked with preschoolers and of course with Head Start and so forth.
This was your program, one that you initiated?
No, I didn't do anything by myself. It was also very shared. You have to create a shared vision, and then when you get people from different agencies that are involved with these families, and they can see how they can have great outcomes and have less cost, because then child welfare didn't have to pay for as much foster care or as much institutional placement or whatever for these infants, and didn't have scandals of infant deaths to the same degree that they might have otherwise. And so there's a huge payoff. And so you get everybody at the table and you talk about how you can do this and what kind of common outcomes you want. And people are idealistic, and they want to do what will make for better outcomes and be the most humane thing. And when you do that, you get just amazing results. And so it was people, Kathy Pinson was there, and she was very helpful with all this. Janet Dean now is the a team leader for the community infant program, and she's a phenomenal, just amazing person.
So one of the things Dr. Warner said was the hallmark of your work was collaboration with other agencies. So that was, I'm getting the impression that was that you initiated that multi-agency programming?
No, again, it was never just me, because you couldn't do it by yourself. You have to sort of meet with them and keep.
I guess your vision of how to, you have these different agencies and there's similar goals in each agency, but they all have specialties.
Yes.
And so in order to really serve a person in the community, when it's a complex case,
you need it to be integrated.
You needed it to be integrated. And so that, it seems like that's where you got other people to have that vision. Is that true? That it was like somebody had to come down from somewhere and say, I
was one of the seeds.
Yeah.
I certainly was one of the seeds, and I would meet with somebody else and see, well, is there another seed? And then we'd have 2 seeds, and then we'd go to the 3rd, and then pretty soon we'd have a group.
Yeah.
And then we'd have a whole field of dandelions.
Yeah, and great things happened.
Yeah.
So tell me, there was...
Then another program that we started in much the same way was we started day treatment programs. Well, day treatment programs were already in place because it was part of the federal mandate in the 1970s for community mental health centers to have them. But they had sort of slid a little bit. And so we got those kind of repowered back up, both with the schools and child welfare involved, social services. And then we started something called Impact. And this is such a wonderful program. It's still going on today. And it has resulted in Boulder County having half of the placement rate in state juvenile prisons as the rest of the state. And pretty much half of the child welfare placements as well. Because again, we joined with, and this time not just with public health and social services, but also with the juvenile justice system. And we started this program called Impact. And so people used to think that you couldn't do these things because of confidentiality. Well, you just get the family to see what a great advantages this is going to be to them, and they will happily sign the waivers. And you have a uniform waiver, you get it approved by all the lawyers in sight and so forth. And then you can do the program. And that's what we did. And so still going on. Probably if you went out there just now, you could find a table where the family is present. And the adolescent and the parents, because they're part of the team, and the workers from these different agencies, and they're forming a treatment plan. How can we best keep you out of placement and keep you in school? And the schools are an important part as well, important players. And then we worked with the city of Boulder also to have school-based workers, and that's still going on.
Wow. So this program keeps kids that might be placed in the state or in another home in the home instead.
Exactly, to the degree possible. Yeah. I mean, some kids are too dangerous to themselves or others, and then you have to make sure they're secure and their family's secure. But there are a whole lot that don't need that if you have frequent home-based services. And I helped grow these programs as one of the seeds, and I used to watch this stuff and I'd think, oh, that sounds like so much fun, I wish I could do it. And so when I retired, that's one of the things I wanted to do, and Barbara Ryan and Laura's sister that came before her were kind enough to let me continue to work and be a home-based family therapist for those 3 years after I retired.
So you got to
loved it.
Implement it and then be a person working directly with the clients.
It was very fun.
Yeah, that's great.
And using the technology of how we do therapy has improved so much in the last 20 years. Not just the medications, which continue to improve, not as much as we would like them to, because there's still side effects, and they're still not perfect. But I think the technology about therapy has improved just tremendously, and systems family therapy is, you know, just one of the many models. Multiple systemic family therapy. I mean, they have different good names, but it's, you know, and they have mostly cognitive behavioral kind of approaches. And one of the other things I wanted to learn was, one of the reasons I realized that I was ready to retire and get back into it, when I went to a state meeting, I went to a seminar on dialectical behavioral therapy, and I was so turned on. It was so much fun. It was so much more fun than the bureaucracy of the state. So I'm ready to do that. So I got immersed in that and learned how to do it.
That's interesting. Okay, so then can you address the PACE program?
Yes. Oh,
Maybe tell us what it is, and then.
The PACE program is, well, it started with Judge Balin. Oh my God, what a wonderful person she is. And she started really this seed, and I was a seed that came with her, and Dr. Warner as well. And Sheriff Epp, who was a great guy, George Epp. Anyway, and Chuck from the health department, Chuck Stout. And so anyway, we got called to this meeting by Judge Balin. She said there are too many people with mental illness in the jail. Well, we had heard that before. We had a worker placed at the jail. We always did. And emergency psychiatric services workers went to the jail and still do. Charlie goes to the jail at night and to see people and see if they evaluate them, see if we can get them out and put into Warner House, which was another program we started, or into the hospital or whatever they need, if we can get them transferred, if they're safe enough. But anyway, there were still a lot of people in the jail that had, usually it wasn't just mental illness, it was also substance abuse, and had broken some law, and that's why they were there. The health department was responsible for the alcohol treatment program and the alcohol treatment program to some degree, although the mental health center had some of it. But we all got with Judge Balin, and we said, well, let's work together and see what we can create.
Okay. This is part B, a continuation of the interview with Phoebe Norton, which is being recorded for Marie Rogers' oral history program. Today is May 16th, 2013, and my name is Suzanne Conversano. So Phoebe, did you have anything else you wanted to add about the PACE program?
Yes, so anyway, we're sitting with the chief judge and people from law enforcement and so forth, and social services and health, and feeling very put on the spot as the mental health center, and we were trying to do our best already, but I always thought that we might do more if we could get a more integrated program with the justice system for these folks. But you got to be on the same page with them, and I had recently heard some research which made me feel this way even more strongly, and that was that we used to think that particularly for any kind of mental health treatment, but particularly for substance abuse, if it wasn't voluntary, it wouldn't work. And then there was some research done on people that had alcoholism, and what they found was that it didn't matter whether it was voluntary or involuntary. What mattered was the length, the time in treatment. Now that was a revelation, and this was in the late around 1998, 99 that this research was performed. So not too long ago, and it really changed, and that allowed us to think in a different way, because before that people would be on probation and they'd be sent to the mental health center. And I know because even when I was a director, I always carried some cases because I wanted to see what the paperwork was like for people, because it could be pretty oppressive sometimes. What the cases were like. I didn't carry a lot, but a few, just to see what the systems were like and how we might be more helpful to support the workers. Anyway, one of the people that I saw was referred by probation, and he would come and tell me, oh, the probation worker, this, that, what a son of a gun he is, and he doesn't really give me the time of day. I don't see him that often. And he would go, of course, and tell his probation officer that he couldn't really get into the mental health center. Never mind that I would see him. And and I would, phone, it was before emails, and I would phone the probation officer, and we would trade phone calls, and we would get on the same page eventually, and we had to have, of course, release of information and so forth, which we had. But it was still very difficult because, the probation officer had tons of cases. I didn't have very many, but I was busy with a lot of other things as well. And so the treatment I thought wasn't ideal. And I was thinking, boy, it would be so much better if we could really be on a team. And so one of the things that, as we brainstormed about this, and everybody had, their own experiences that they brought to the table that sort of supported this image of an integrated team that would include substance abuse treatment worker, mental health worker, a psychiatrist, the psychiatric nurse on site to give out medications, and a probation worker on site. And so all these people would come to one place. They would get a lot of social support, get help with finding housing, jobs, etc. They would get urinary analysis to make sure that they were doing okay, and then they would get all their treatment right there. And at first they might come in every day, and then they would maybe come in, just 3 times a week. And we used dialectical behavioral treatment, and I helped do a group there using DBT, which I loved. It was really fun. I did it with the chief probation officer. She and I did it together. It was really fun. And the people really responded to this kind of, this kind of cognitive behavioral work. It was easier for them to relate to, I think. And they could incorporate some of the skills into their lives immediately. It was one of the examples of the newer technology that I think is so successful. And so we did this, and we got a site, and we got the team together, and they all bought into the vision, and we hired a team leader that was both a psychiatric worker and also a substance abuse treatment worker. And so he really understood the vision as well. And at the end of the year, we had treated, I think, about 100 people. We did a follow-up study, and the success surpassed our expectations by, we had reduced jail days for that population from the year before they started the treatment to the year after by 99%.
Wow.
We were just blown away by it.
Yeah.
We gave a presentation. George Yep and Judge Bale and I went down to the state because word got around, and we were invited to come to the state and present to a legislative committee and some people from the Division of Corrections and so forth, Department of Corrections, in at one of the state office buildings. And I put together a PowerPoint, and we went down and presented it. And they said, well, these people can't be as dangerous. What are their LSATs? That's a measurement of how dangerous they are. And they were just as dangerous on that scale as the sort of the average for people that were in state prisons. Of course, we all know that there are people in the state prisons that we should be treating in the community. And these were people with dual diagnosis. They are higher risk because of the substance abuse, because people with mental illness are not more dangerous than the general population. But if you had substance abuse on top of that, it goes up by 20%, the risk of violence goes up by 20%, both for people with mental illness and for people in the general population. So, you know, we knew that we were dealing with a higher risk population, but we had very tight watch on them. Now, of course people would slip. That's part of the whole picture of recovery with addictions. But instead of sending them back to prison or to jail, they'd maybe get a weekend in jail, or work detail or something like that. But they'd still have to come back to the program and work the program. And you have to have everybody on the same page as this. And one of the things that Judge Balin pointed out wasn't enough just to have the courts involved. We also needed to have the public defenders and the district attorney office at the table and be part of the management group for this, the overall group, because if you don't get them involved, then a plan's already made between the DA and the district attorney. So you have to, the district attorney and the public defender. So you have to get them on the same page, and so we ended up having people referred by the GL. What a real systems thing. You really have to work to keep these systems working together. And that program's still going on, and it's still very successful. And the county commissioners, of course, love it, because at that time meant they didn't have to build a new jail, because it was one of the tipping places it helped. It was one of the helping pieces to not have to build. Now it's a different picture because it's 10 years later.
Did the other places in the state copy this program?
Other places have looked at both the impact program and at PACE, and they've had visitors, and I think people have formed that people have to form their own, create their own, and do what works for them. And but I know that Larimer County has picked up some of these.
So you have talked a little bit about what your goals were.
Oh, excuse me, I was going to say,
sure.
In addition, there's something very similar, actually, which is the mental health courts and the drug abuse courts and the integrated services courts. And of course, Judge Balin has extended that both for youths and adults.
And that's in
Boulder. And Arapahoe County does that, and some other counties as well. And that's a really great approach as well.
Yeah. Thank you. So you've talked a little bit about, through the interview, about what your goals have been. And I was just wondering if you could maybe just summarize what your goals were when you became executive director of the Mental Health Center.
I didn't know. I just knew that I wanted to make things much better for people with major mental illness of all ages, and do anything I could to help them do well in the community and not be in hospitals like the one that I grew up in. And of course, Fort Logan's a wonderful hospital, and it is smaller, and it's a good hospital. So it's not that I think hospitals have a place, and they're part of the continuum of care, and people should be able to go there if they need to, and then get back out quickly into a supported system of care. Just as prisons have a place, but people should be able to get out, and especially if they're mentally ill and have a history of substance abuse, and have not just be dumped on the street, but get out and have a place to be in supported care.
So it was you had sort of a big vision when you came in.
I didn't know what it was going to look like, or what we'd be able to work together around. We also worked hard to get the volunteer program. It was primarily, at first, a volunteer program for the elderly, to reach out to the elderly. It's still going very strong under Helen Bayless. It's a great program for home-based services for the elderly. Uses a lot of volunteers very effectively. And impact and space, and we've talked about those. And the rape crisis team grew. I didn't initiate that. Laura's sister did in the 1960s, along with Janet Roberts and some other wonderful women. And it's still going strong. And most of the programs, the psychiatric, the continuum of care for people with major mental illness of all ages again. And bilingual, bicultural services are very important. In my concept, some centers I know around the nation, and it's a perfectly okay thing to do, had a separate team of Spanish-speaking workers, for instance. My feeling was, and those of the people around me, was that we should have people of color and Spanish-speaking people on every team. So that we strove, our goal was to reflect the demographics of the community in that time. At that time we set our goal to have about 15 or 20% of each team be people of color or Spanish speaking. And we also had a specialized outreach program for the Hmong when they were here and before they became more integrated. And that reminded me of something else I was going to say in that respect. I forget what it was.
So, did you have a specific management style?
You know, I've learned this as a social worker. And at the University of Chicago, you start where people are, you build on their strengths. And that's what I felt we should do with workers as well. And with managers and supervisors and team leaders, whatever, you look for their strengths and you build on them. And that's the way you get the best out of people. And it worked for me. I mean, and it doesn't always work. There maybe 1%, but boy, that's a wonderful thing. And Dottie can attest to this, working in the mental health field. These are wonderful people. These are people that really care about what they're doing, and they care about other human beings, and they care about people that they may present to the rest of the world as not so lovable, but people, mental health workers, you know, you're one of them. It's a very special group of people.
How did you maintain staff morale?
You know, we worked at that a lot, and you know, we never paid as much as we should. But we paid as much as we paid better than other mental health centers, but still you couldn't pay too much more because then your unit costs would get out of sync, and then you would you'd be in trouble with the state and so forth. So you had to have some balance, but we always tried to push the envelope, but it was never enough. It wasn't as much as school teachers, still isn't, even for 9 or 12 months. Not that teachers are paid well. I think they should be paid more. But for what mental worth. But the morale, I think, comes from the product and from the work itself. And I think that the things that, and I learned this from one of my patients, a person, a man that I still have coffee with occasionally. He had severe schizophrenia and substance abuse. He got over his substance abuse while I was helping him, and he was a big reader. He only was able to go through about 8th grade because of his severe illness, but he came from an intellectual family, and so he liked to read Kafka. And he gave me he gave me the trial to read. So I read the trial. I said, you know, I don't understand what this is about. Tell me what this is about, Jim. And that's not his real name. And he said, don't you see, Phoebe, it's about the dehumanizing effect of bureaucracy. Now, you know, he was a very bright guy, so whether he came up with that or a discussion with his family, but I said, oh, of course. And that was one of the ways that I really tried to help with staff morale, was to be, and all of our team leaders and all of our managers did too, because it was one of our values was to try to protect them from too much of the oppression of the bureaucracy. Because the bureaucracy began to get worse and worse and worse and worse in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it just continued to this day. And we have more layers of administration now than we used to. Used to be mental health centers contracted directly with the state. Now the state decided they wanted to privatize the system. So they contract with these private managed care companies who turn around and subcontract with the mental health centers. Now, the mental health centers are private nonprofits, but they're nonprofits.
Yeah.
And the state may contract with a for-profit managed care company whose home base is in Virginia or someplace, you know, and they take 10% right off the top. Not to say they don't do some good things, but is it good enough that we should be subtracting 20% or even more for administrative services from the direct services? That wasn't one of my values.
When I talked to Dr. Warner, he said that Phoebe was always keen to minimize expenditures on administration and to put money into services.
I guess you can see that. Well, you asked me about morale, and that was one of the ways that we tried to help build. And we tried to appreciate, you know, I visited teams, and so did Dr. Warner to some degree, lesser degree, because he didn't have as much, wasn't part of his job really. But we really tried to celebrate the successes. And the successes were when you could tell us about somebody that was better. The successes were about measuring our outcomes and, you know, then going and celebrating that with the team. And we did other things, picnics and so forth, and bonuses occasionally, but those aren't the real things. The real things, what feeds mental health workers. I remember one time the board wanted to give a Mental Health Worker of the Year award, and they had the teams then select, you know, the mental health worker from their team, and then to bubble up. That everybody hated it. And I went back and tried to, because I tried to keep up with the management literature. Fortunately, my partner was in charge of management training for US West. So she fed me all these wonderful, greatest books, newest stuff, and so I was able to get the research about this. And I found out that what fed our kind of worker was not the competitive stuff. That might feed a salesperson, but that's not our worker. Our kind of person has more of an affiliation need. So you want to feed that, and you want to feed and help them to feel successful about what they're doing. And that's how you build morale, in my opinion.
Well, that's very good. You and Dr. Warner worked together. He was the medical director, and you were the executive director. This is what he said to me about his work with you. He said, Phoebe made possible pretty much everything I did at the mental health center. We had identical values. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your relationship with Dr. Warner, how you collaborated, and how your values sort of were expressed through the programs that you implemented.
Yeah, well, Dick, a very special person. I think of him as one of my soulmates. And we worked together for 35 years, something like that. And he really cared about having the best possible services for people with major mental illness. And he is a rare kind of person that is a practitioner but also a researcher. And so he really paid attention to the data and outcomes, and was up on all the latest research on what was helpful and all the latest ways to be certain that your diagnosis was correct. And even today, that's one of the, with his program, Colorado Recovery, people send people to him because he's such a good diagnostician. He may change it, and the diagnosis they've lived with before, and change the medications slightly, and suddenly it's like a miracle. The person gets better. And he has that. I don't. That's not my expertise. Right. And but I always felt that the psychiatrists have the medical legal liability for the course of a case, and of course they should listen to input, and there should be a team decision about what the case planning is. But that if it were an argument in the last analysis, the psychiatrist has to call the shots because they are the ones that put, not me. My role was really to facilitate and to create the structure for them and all the other specialists to work and do their best. But Dick and I shared that, wanting to be helpful to the most severely mentally ill, and he brought in people from all over the world to give in-service training to our people. That's another kind of way you keep morale up, is help people feel like they're on the cutting edge of what's, and to improve their skills. And I was so blessed to have him as a partner. But I had other wonderful partners because he wasn't so interested in children. So we had other wonderful partners like Barbara Ryan for children and adolescents.
So it sounds like really your values were similar and your goals were similar, but your skills were really different, but they complemented each other.
That's right.
Perfectly, in that you were all really good at what you did, and so all together you guys were able to create a very effective and successful mental health system.
Well, we hope so. Yeah.
So you talked about a little bit, when did you leave the mental health center?
I wanted to mention, I wanted to back up for a second, because one of the things we got into in a big way while I was director was housing for people with major mental illness. And we knew this was a very important part of the continuum, but we didn't realize how important. And we had helped nurture a group. Laura Sistra, who's a previous who's since died, but was a previous mental health center director after me, was one of the ones that helped start this Friends and Family of the adults with major mental illness. And that Friends and Family group in Boulder became one of the founding members of a group of people for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is now the most important. And then they joined with others across the nation that were just bubbling up in the 70s. And they created the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is one of the most important education and advocacy organizations for mental illness in the nation. And I'm very proud to have been volunteering with them for the last 6 years. Anyway, one day, because they were a well-formed organization by the 1980s, some of them asked to meet with me, and they came stomping into my office and pounding on my desk and saying, why aren't we doing more for housing for people with major mental illness? Now, I long since learned that you need to really listen to your critics carefully and try to really understand them and empathize with them, and then figure out how you could team with them to what was best of what they were saying to build something. And so those women, they were just amazing. Harriet Newton and Barbara Hancock and Charlene Mann were some of the leaders, and they helped form the state organization and spread it around the state. And there were other groups, and Adams County had some wonderful people too, the wonderful chapter. I remember some of them. And anyway, they then began to help find dollars to help us purchase housing. And we had 2 or 3 houses, well, more than that, 5 or 6 houses that were essentially given to us by families of adults with mental illness. And we provided the services, of course. But Wani Butler sold, grocery script at her church for years and years and years in order to be able to help us get a couple of houses. And one we joined with MROHP to start, called Friendship House, which was, we used a MROHP philosophy, and it was just so, it was sort of the opposite of when I went in, where I took the gun away from the guy. It was the opposite of that. You would go in this house and it was all peaceful, and there'd be fresh flowers, and people were doing mindful attendance with all the patients in that house. All the residents of that house was a real collaborative, democratic kind of community. And but it just felt so peaceful when you went in. It was just so totally amazing. And MROHP actually infused that throughout our programs, and I'm so grateful for that MROHP started the master's program. We were able to have so many of their interns and graduates throughout our programs, because they had so much respect for people with major mental illness and could be so present with them. Learned a lot from them. And I learned a lot from these women who had adult children with major mental illness, and were going to get us to do it right, and we did, and we ended up with over 250 housing spots by the time I retired. Some of those were Section 8s, but we applied for grants too, and were successful in getting some federal housing grants for people with mental illness. And the mental health center, they're starting to sell them now because it's very expensive to maintain them, and they want to create something a little bit different, and they still want the Section 8s, but more, not so much group housing, and they want it to be more individualized. I hope it works out really well.
Let's see.
Anyway, those women were some of my mentors and still are.
You had asked me to ask about the parents who were your role models. Was that what that was then?
That was
okay.
it.
Could I ask something?
Sure. Yes, Dottie.
Could you talk a little bit about the most frustrating things about, or the most discouraging things about your
The
work?
most discouraging things were and I've hinted at it already, the state bureaucracy and the sort of ballooning of that state bureaucracy, not from the Division of Mental Health so much, but from healthcare policy and financing, which oversees the Medicaid program. And it's partly, the federal regulations that get then pushed on the state, and the state then pushes them down. But other states have done it in a different way. You don't have to have it be quite as complicated or as expensive in terms of administration as Colorado is doing it. But I find that I'm just tilting at windmills about that. I always wanted to do something about it, but it's practically impossible. It's so entrenched now that even the mental health center directors thinks that it's fine that we have all these layers. So you have the mental health center, and then you have the managed care company, and then you might have a managed care company on top of that managed care company, as we do here in Boulder. We have Foothills Behavioral Health, and then we have Value Options on top of that, and then the state finally. I just have a totally different point of view, but because of all the bureaucratic requirements, they have found that it helps them meet some of those bureaucratic requirements. Now, I think we should get rid of some of those. I think we should be looking at outcomes, not process measures. And if we look at outcomes, and we have client satisfaction surveys that are administered by consumers, you paid consumers to administer those, I think you can get much more accurate vision of what you're providing. And it is a wonderful thing. And Boulder Mental Health Center, the mental health partners, they've renamed themselves Mental Health Partners because of that philosophy that Barbara continues. And she's been able to maintain these programs in spite of the cuts. I just admire her so much for that. Anyway, one of the things they've done since I've left is they've computerized the records, and I was a volunteer, well, first a worker and then a volunteer, so I worked with that new computer system. They've done a beautiful job of it. It's very efficient, and I think they've done, and that's a good thing. That wasn't a frustration, though it certainly was, had some growing pains as we all became more computerized, but it's the oppressiveness of the state bureaucracy, the dehumanizing factor of it, that you just have to make sure it doesn't sift down to your front ranks. What, would you agree, Dottie?
Yes.
This is a question Dr. Warner gave me.
Yes.
He said, given your selflessness, what rewards did you get from your work?
Seeing the results.
Seeing the results, yeah.
Oh my God, yes, yes. And that's true whether it's a person across the table from you and you can see them light up, or if it's a program and you see the data that comes out of it.
So what would you say your greatest achievements are?
Well, I think it's been just being able to work with such a wonderful group of people. And still with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I still have that privilege.
And
And people like Dottie's husband, Jim Charlo, that was on our board. Just, if it's indescribable to me. I mean, because I've been in lots of different kinds of groups, but in mental health, you just get, and in public services in general, you just get such a great group of people.
and that's its reward. That's your, feel like that's what's fed you over all the years
Absolutely.
to keep you healthy and continue to enjoy your work.
Right. Oh, my family support too. You know, my family is very important to me. Including my dogs. And exercise. I always ran every day when I got home from work, even if it was 9 or 10 o'clock at night.
To keep, and that was what you did to sort of take care of yourself.
That was my meditation, yeah.
Are you hopeful about the future with mental health treatment?
You know, we've had this terrible period we've been through where and it's really disgraceful because we've learned so much and we've been so successful and we've proven again and again and again that these things work. And then to see them not funded and in fact defunded, and to have people end up in prisons instead. And when they're in prisons, and this happened in Colorado, and I helped with the National Alliance on Mental Illness to fight this. When they got these people with mental illness in prisons because they couldn't be served in the communities adequately, then they couldn't manage them because they had cut the funding for the psychiatric nurses in prisons and for the psychiatrist, and they weren't giving them proper medications, etc. And so they became so unmanageable, they put them in administrative isolation. In fact, they built a whole new prison down in southern Colorado to house just for the administrative isolation, which was 23 hours a day in isolation because they couldn't manage these people with, you know, I mean, it wasn't just people with mental illness, but they were a large part of that population of people that they couldn't manage successfully. And because they weren't treating the mental illness, now these were people that we proved you could treat out in the community usually. So then we got a wonderful new director, you know, of the Department of Corrections that really understood this. And he closed that prison that they had just built and said we're going to have better psychiatric care for people. Well, the National Alliance on Mental Illness and others who worked on this a few years ago, just 2 or 3 years ago, were successful in we weren't successful in keeping them from building the prison, but we were successful to get the Joint Budget Committee to put some dollars in the prison budget so that they would have some psychiatric care in prison. So they started to do that, and that helped a little, and then they were needing the administrative isolation less, and then they finally were able to just close that prison completely. And that was partly the doing of our new director of Department of Corrections that just got murdered by somebody who was not mentally ill, incidentally.
Right.
He was a great guy. What's his name?
Clemens.
Clements, that's right. It's a tragedy. His wife is wonderful too, and she's the Director of Human Services for the state of Colorado. But I'm optimistic about the technology and the hopefully new medications, and you know, we know how to do it. It's just convincing. It seems to me that it should be an easy sell because it's so cost effective and so much more humane. And people used to say, well, we don't have money. Well, we do have money. We're spending it on prisons, and we don't need to be.
Right.
And I think there's just a glimmer that we're beginning to get that in this country.
How would you like to be remembered?
Well, as someone who supported people to be their best.
Is there anything else you would like to share?
No, thanks so much for doing this, Suzanne. It's been fun.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.